is Kate Elliott, and we are here with Narrative Worlds. It's February 2023, which I still can't get my head wrapped around, but anyway, I know. And I'm here today with Ken Liu, who is back. Last time we talked about technology and in world building, and this time I asked Ken to come back so we could just talk about world building at like big ticket world building at its largest, most impactful and immersive level, and what that means. And Ken is the author of The Dandelion Dynasty, a 4-volume epic fantasy, which has truly immersive and impactful world building, and also a bunch of short stories and short story collections, and some TV adaptations of your work as well. Did you want to add anything to that, Ken?
No, this is better than I ever could have talked about my own stuff. So thank you, Kate.
Yeah, usually when people ask me, I say, yeah, I wrote some things. You know,
yeah, exactly. Yeah.
All right. So, and Ken and I can talk for hours.
But we only have one. So
but we only have one. So for those who are here with us today, and I see we have a few lovely people with us today, please feel free to put questions in the Q&A place, whatever that's called. I won't be reading the sidebar commentary because I can't multitask that well. And we will, because we want to get to questions too. Ken and I will talk for a little while, and then hopefully we can follow up with anything anyone is confused or curious about. Who knows? So I wanted to start, Ken, with something I read this week on Twitter, for those few who are still on Twitter.
I know, like Twitter.
Twitter, I'm sorry. I like, they'll carry me off when it's like, you know, my cold dead hands. Twitter.
Well, either that or when Elon decides to finally flip the switch and shut it down. So we'll see.
Exactly. That's what I'm figuring is going to happen. Anyway, there was a little discussion there about something a person who I don't know, evidently a booktuber, said, that there's so much fantasy written in the setting of medieval Europe that it's overdone, and people should stop using that as a setting. And of course, my immediate response was, actually, not that much fantasy is really set in medieval Europe.
That is true.
And I thought about why I think that. And I mean, what makes up a narrative landscape? So is the first question. But when someone says that most fantasy is set in a version of medieval Europe, what I think is that it's really a set of props, like theatrical props, and a set of expectations. People see those, and then they say in their head, this is medieval Europe, even though it often has very little to do with medieval Europe. Oftentimes elements of it are really closer to early modern Europe, but oftentimes it's not even really Europe. It's like Hollywood Europe or medieval Europe or Victorian.
Or Dungeons and Dragons version of European inspired.
Right. And there aren't any
like
guns. Yeah, there's no guns. So therefore there's, you know, or some version of Arthuriana. And that made me, and so in a way, if the story violates either the props or the expectations, then readers will say, oh, well, this isn't right. And I wanted to talk about world building a little bit about this idea of props and expectations as world building, and how we can get beyond that.
You know, the thing, Kate, talking to you is always so fascinating, because you ask the most evocative and provocative and complicated questions that are just very, very meaty to tackle. This whole idea about world building as a set of props and expectations is really at the core of, you know, world building, right? I mean, I think Joe Walton was the one who said that when you're doing world building, what you're really doing is world is including, right? You're giving clues to the reader who
Yeah.
then
Yeah.
has to fill in the blanks. And the way readers fill in the blanks will be dependent on their meta narrative of all the Tolkien and all the Dungeons and Dragons and all the Magic the Gathering and all the other fantasies they've engaged with in some manner, and then they use those as the template to fill in what you say when you talk about a knight, right? There's a particular vision of what a knight is, that people bring to the table, and I think world builders have to sort of writers, in at least in our genre, writing in our language for our audience, however you want to define that, will have to account for all of that. You're not writing in a blank space, right? I mean, you are
Yeah.
writing in the middle of all of that. You are joining a conversation that's already happening. So you can't use the word night and expect people to not have those visions in their heads. So I think that's really interesting. I mean, when we talk about too many fantasies are set in medieval Europe, I wonder if people are just sort of talking about the fact that they would like to see different props, or maybe they have certain, they've grown tired of certain narratives around those props and expectations, and they want them to be thwarted, or be given some new props to play with. I don't know. That's what comes to mind. What do
It's
you
an
think?
interesting too, actually. I'm sorry, I got to break in here because then there's like, well, other props can sometimes be a set of props from a different culture with
Mm,
a different set of expectations for them. So again, if you break what their idea of the correct props and expectations are, then they'll say, well, this isn't right either.
yeah,
So I'm
yeah.
sorry, but go back to where
No,
you were
you're
going.
absolutely right. I mean,
Yeah.
I do think that whenever you bring something in, people have certain expectations of what needs to happen. And it is it's an interesting question. And there are so many layers to this. The way you can't even use a word without
Yeah.
bring all the dictionary that comes with it. You refer to one thing, and people bring all of these, readers have to bring all of these expectations, and it's very hard to get away from them. I guess that's something that we should talk about. Like, do you what do you think about props and expectations and how we world build them? And do you, if you find them, because I do, if you find them to be restrictive and to not be the wonderful tools, meaning that you would like to get people to stop, and take notice of what you're doing and not bring their expectations in and sort of just use it to say, I know the story already, I know what's going on. Like, what are some of your thoughts on that? And how do you do it? And what are some things that you found to be interesting or unexpected in the process?
So, this is so interesting because, I mean, for one thing, I think to begin with, the writer and world builder has to acknowledge what you've just said, that we come in, we use the word night and it means something to the reader. And that what it means to the reader may be different what it means to you. It may be different to what you want to use it for.
Mm,
And we can't control that. You have yourself said in other conversations we've had that the reader has their own relationship, I'm paraphrasing, has their own relationship with the book, with the work, with the narrative that we, the writer, cannot control.
mhm.
And it's that relationship is also a living thing. And it's going to be different for every reader. So we can't control that. So all we can control is how we approach what we're doing. And I always want to say, kind of my standard disclaimer to writers is, if people want to write in absolutely to follow the props and the expectations that are most familiar to them, that they feel comfortable with, or that they feel are most commercial, I don't have any issue with that. I think for us that we're really addressing, what do you want to do if you want to kind of try to break out of that a little? And I want to come back this is even kind of starting in the middle instead of at the beginning. But I want to come back to this idea of when we use a word, you said that when we use a word we can't use a word without bringing what comes with it.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that happens when we're writing a really big story, maybe a multi-volume story in a densely built world that has layers. It has layers of a physical landscape and an environment or environments that the people live in. It has a psychocultural element to it, and what I call like a chronological historical element to it. You would add, I don't know if technological would be separate or part of those three, but one of the things, for example, that you do in the Dandelion Dynasty books is that by the third and fourth books, you are referencing things. It might be poetry, it might be a cultural, something that people culturally are accustomed to. It could be anything that you have built up over several books. So by the time we get to book 3 or 4, where someone from a colonized island chain is studying the poetry of the colonizers and loves it, but is also trying to reconnect with their own home culture.
Mm-hmm.
And that split between we can only have the pure, so-called pure, which is never pure poetry because it changes over time, of the colonizer, or a restoration of the authentic indigenous culture, which is also not possible, and
Mm-hmm.
trying to find a bridge between the two. By the time we get to that, as a reader, I understand where I am. And that's because of how you built it. And taking the time to build my understanding of your world, the way that I bring as someone who has read many a fantasy novel, right, with with these props and expectations that fit this kind of a view of medieval Europe. I bring those. I know who Arthur is, I know the story of Lancelot, Guinevere, and Arthur well enough that if you allude to it, I get the connection. So how does world building happen where by the time I get to book 4 in Speaking Bones, that I can have that same relationship? And that's the world building. I'm not saying people have to do that kind of world building. I'm just saying I love that in a world.
I'm with you. I mean, that's what I love about a lot of, in my view, okay, I think actually all fiction does that to some extent. So I have this theory that the writers who are interesting to read always invent their own language to tell the stories that they can tell, but they have to sort of invent their own language to do so. And you have to sort of, as a reader, learn that language before you can really actually see the world that they're building. And this is not limited to fantasy or sci-fi. It's
that's right.
True in the realist mode too. But I think there's a little bit more here that what you brought up that I think is really critical. You and I both do this. And I see that being done by a lot of writers that we enjoy, and it's the following, which is the recognition that this idea of being self-referential, being building on layers and layers of what has come before, is the way culture works. Period. Right. So language and culture are basically secondhand stories all the way down. Okay, what I mean by that is this: it's that every word we use has been used by somebody else before. Even when we make up neologisms, we're using roots that other people have already given meaning to. There's no word we are using, no sentence we're putting together, no trope that we're evoking that's entirely new. They're all secondhand in the sense that they all have resonances and stories built up around them. And yet, nonetheless, we are able to tell original stories and convey original thoughts. Part of that is because it is always about using secondhand words to tell brand new stories. That's what culture is. And the joy of writing and reading comes from the sense that you, as the reader, are experiencing something new. And that requires you to actually construct meaning for yourself that's brand new out of secondhand words that you're being handed. So I think for world building to be effective in the sense that you're talking about, you really have to sort of view the book itself as teaching the reader to read a new language, to experience a new culture. And that means they have to start by learning some of the base stories, only to see how those base stories later on can build up into new stories. I think
Yeah.
having reinterpretation of what has come before is a really critical part of the sense of progression, the sense of you really getting to know a language or getting to know a culture. I mean, those of us who have studied languages know that the fun part comes from the moment when you see a word that you thought you knew being used in a new way, and you're like, oh, I get that. I get the logic of it. I get how
Yeah.
this is built up, and I can see myself inventing new utterances in the language that I'm learning. But that's what you want in world building too. You want to teach the reader the rules, the base stories of the culture, and see how they come up with new variations and evolve over time, so that the reader can now themselves feel that sense of building, of gathering meaning, of no longer being merely thrown into a world without being able to understand what's happening, but now being able to follow its logic and create new meaning and um, understand new concepts in that world based on what's already in the world. I think that's when you feel like I'm learning something real here. I feel like I'm in the presence of a real living, breathing culture. To me, that's what gives the world building that we enjoy its sense of reality, meaning it has become so layered and complex that you can now see new stories being built upon the old pieces that's already there. That each thing you learn is meaningful because it comes back and becomes the foundation for more meaning.
And yeah, I wanted to talk actually about layers, but I also this element of, oh God, there's so much, but also this element of time and change, because one of the benefits of writing a series when you're not packing all the, like, I'm introducing the world in book one and then there's no more change in the world, right? It's static. Culture is never static. And I think sometimes I think it's important for writers and world builders to think about how lack of stasis is not only what makes a world rich, but also what drives character and plot, not only in the sense to begin with, right? Oh, this person had to come from this city to that city in order to trade some spices, right? But as the story goes on, and if world building is done well, and again, I'm going to use Dandelion Dynasty, which takes place over about 100 years, about 100 years. We had this whole conversation at your Speaking Bones paperback launch, right?
That's
So
right.
fast. Yeah, you can find it on Mysterious Galaxy's website, or talk about that. But then later on, how things are different from the beginning, and then you get the contrast. So the change itself drives plot. And the change itself drives the choices that characters make. But if a world builder sees things as static, like I'm going to make a notebook, and there's, here's my history, and here's my magic system. And I mean, I make notebooks so I can have references. This isn't an anti-notebook screed here at all. But the sense that things, once they're written down, are static, that they don't change, but things always change. And I sometimes think that's starting with this idea that, first of all, things will change. Things will change across the course of your story. And that change is a good way to think about world building. And then how world building intertwines and layers with each other. I wanted to ask you to maybe talk a little bit about where I'm going to laugh now. where you started with the Dandelion Dynasty books. So here we sit. So last year I wrote a romantic fantasy novel set in a completely new world, about which it had more of a vibe to me than, I didn't start with a notebook. It had more of a vibe to me. I knew like the aesthetic I wanted, which is, I can't really quantify that.
Yeah.
But I knew some of the pieces of things. I wanted a bureaucratic society. I wanted a society that had a lot of hierarchical layers, but yet on one vector, but yet was very relaxed about other things. I remember talking to someone once who was talking about the in Hawaii, before the arrival of the Westerners, the colonizers, and specifically the missionaries.
Mhm.
They said there were a lot of taboos around food, who got to eat what and when, right? But sex, who cared? So the missionaries come in, right? And they're like, well, food, right? We eat food, right? But sex, right? So this clash of hierarchical systems and what people think is important to. So that was my vibe, right, for this thing. And then as I wrote it, it's interesting to me. I don't even know if I can recapitulate it yet, right? It hasn't settled in a lot. I would like find pieces fitting in that I would then write down in my notebook. So I was like discovering the world as I went. But a lot of the way I work now comes from me having done so much world building in the past, that there's a lot of stuff I don't think about consciously anymore. I just kind of do it, like leave myself open to it. So can you talk a little bit about where you started? Like if I'm a newer writer, and I haven't done a lot of world building, maybe, or I'm not sure how to make it more complicated, however to start, what would you tell them? I don't want to say practical tips, but you know what I mean.
Yeah, I do. I mean, I think what you've said there is really it really resonates with me a lot in terms of how I work. I'm very sort of theme driven in terms of how I think about stories.
Yes, you are.
So I start out by thinking, okay, what is the thing that I'm interested in here? I'm interested in the idea of modernity, right? In the Dandelion Dynasty, I'm interested in the idea of modernity. How does modernity emerge from pre-modern times? So if you have a people with these mythological stories, with this sort of history, and they're on the verge of modernity because the means of production have evolved to a certain point. There's a critical mass of new ideas about understanding the natural world and manipulating the natural world to achieve our own ends. There's a critical mass of power being concentrated. There's a critical mass of a sense of emerging political class consciousness, for lack of a better term. All of this stuff, if all of these things are together, we're in the moment of historical inflection point. What does that mean? If that is actually the thing I'm starting out with, I'm starting out right in the heart of change. This is on the verge of a major change. What would I do to make sure that the world follows through, that the world feels like a world on the verge of change, a world on the verge of modernity? So that's kind of how I thought about it. That was my big theme-driven top-down idea.
But you have to start by showing the world it's not even the base, because of course the world that you present at the beginning of Grace of Kings, in the first like half of that book, is a world that itself is built on change and on several layers of change. So it's easy to start with history, but history itself is not static.
Well, see, even in that moment, I presented people as having very different attitudes about what's happening. There are those who tell themselves a story of stasis. They say that the world is in chaos right now, and what we need to do is restore it back to the way it used to be for thousands of years. And we know that's not true. Nothing stays the same for thousands of years, but it's a very
Yeah.
common narrative that people have. Those who are reactionary or conservative will present this idea that our history is static, that things pretty much stayed the same for hundreds of
Yeah.
years, and that was
Yeah.
perfect. We should just go back to that. And those who are
Yeah.
revolutionaries will say,
Yeah.
no, that's not true. So I started out right away in my world by having competing characters with these competing narratives about the way the world is. And it's up to you as the reader to figure out whose vision is closer to the truth. But I, right away, it's because it is my theory that stories are more important than institutions, that I made the
I love
stories that
that.
characters
Yeah.
tell about their own
Yeah.
world the centerpiece. That's why the books are so full of these historical accounts, competing historical. I mean, I literally have in one of the books this thing that I'm sure you enjoyed, where I present a classic story supposedly written thousands of years ago, and then I present layers of commentaries that people have written
Yes.
over the
Yes.
years on it.
Yes.
This is very conscious, this reflection on
Yeah.
what stories mean and how people have interpreted stories differently over the years. It's sort of like our own engagement with the story of George Washington, right? You've got the cherry tree, you've got the George Washington stories of his teeth, his false teeth, both the set that's made of animal parts and the set made from the teeth of enslaved people. And what does that mean? How does that change our
Yeah.
view of this great hero
Yeah.
of ours? Um, that's just a nonstop process, the process of retelling the stories of our heroes and trying to reinterpret them and trying to re-understand them, reintegrate them, recontextualize them, recommitting to their vision and rejecting parts of their stories. This is not a static process. It's always dynamic. People talk about historical revisionism. All history is revisionism. It's
Yeah.
always about
Yeah.
revisionism. And so I made that the centerpiece of my world building in the Denton Dynasty. I made this historical revisionism not a thing that's just engaged by a few, but a thing that everyone engages in. And in fact, in the latter books, you see them engaging historical revisionism about the very events you read about in the
Yes.
first book. And that is how,
Yes.
I make this
Yes.
really visceral and true.
And that's also how you immerse the reader, because then the reader will be reading something in book 3 and say, wait, that's not what happened.
Yes.
I read what happened.
Right.
And that to me is that's one of the things I love about this kind of world building, is that you get that immersion. That, I mean, obviously a narrative world is never going to be the real world. It can't, right? But you can get that. I don't even have any words to explain why I enjoy that so much, why I enjoy reading Tolkien with this sense that this is this world that has this weight of centuries or millennia of, tragedy behind it, right? It's satisfying for me. But, I wanted to come.
I really do love it. And I think this is something that, so I wonder if when you do this, you're also being very theme driven, or it's because you do it almost instinctively because it is just the way you see the world. Because, one example would be something like, I'll take one of your simpler books like Court of Fives, which I'm reading, right? So it's interesting to me, it's striking to me really that almost immediately you go in there and start talking about how, this is a world in change. The ruling family came here only maybe 100 years ago, and they were fleeing from their homeland, and now they have a whole narrative about their culture being imposed on this. And then there's this huge amount of conflict between the colonized people in terms of, do they want to follow the old ways, or do they need to be even more more like the colonizers than they are.
Right.
There's a lot of internal division and differences. And I found that very striking, because a lot of times when people who don't read fantasy talk about fantasy, they imagine it as some sort of very static thing, that there's no internal conflict. There's one culture, one idea, one language, everything is the same. But you were very clear from the very beginning that's not the case, that there's a huge amount of conflict, change, and different desires for how things will go. Is that something that you consciously put in there, or is that just because instinctively you believe this feels more real?
I think that for me, I think that I think like you, that I'm a bit of a theme-driven writer. I'm really fascinated by change, whether it be in the characters, whether it be in, and I don't believe in static societies.
Yeah.
Because even if, as you said, it is a standard narrative, that thing, we could just go back to that golden age, and that's been around for a really long time. In different human societies. If we'll just go back to that golden age when things were as they ought to be. But of course, they never were that way back then. But this idea of where are you starting from? And I wonder if that's something writers can think about for themselves, because there isn't a right answer. You don't have to start with themes. You can start with whatever it is that matters to you.
Yeah,
and
whatever you
I feel like when you start world building with that, it's like, why do I want to start here? Where's the best? Well, there's two questions really. Where's the best place to start for me to, I don't know, get that theme or that vibe or that base on which to, catapult myself into what comes next? So that would be one. And then why is it this? Like, am I just doing this because it feels like where I ought to, or is there a reason? I'm an overanalyzer. I like to have a reason for where I start. And sometimes I think that one of the main things about world building that writers can do to help themselves is just to stop and take a breath and say, why am I doing it this way? Is this the best way for me to do it? And it might be, but maybe there's another way. If you think about why you're starting there and what you want to accomplish, what do you want the world to accomplish in terms of how it interweaves with the characters and plot? I don't think world can be disentangled from characters and plot. I think that, yeah. I think sometimes I read things that I think it is again, just props. They're walking through a theater, basically with theater facades and props and doing things.
Sure.
And that's fine. And I don't say that in a dismissive way. That's fine. That's sometimes what someone wants to write and someone wants to read. But you don't get that thing at the end. You can't quite build from that into that moment where someone's reading book 4 and says, wait, this was what happened. I read what happened. And now they're telling a different story about it.
What would you say, Kate, to someone who is trying to write a big book and trying to tell a story about a big world? Like, what would you say to them if their question is, how do I know what things I have to know about and what things I can figure it out later? How do I know that?
How do we know anything? That's such a hard question. And one of the things that I wanted to actually, and I'm glad that you asked it, because it is actually kind of a core question for this. Partly it's going to depend on what you, the writer, are interested in, because there's a lot of different angles at which to come at worlds. I see levels, I tend to see the levels and the change. That's why I talked about the physical landscape and the psychocultural landscape and the chronological historical landscape. These are all landscapes that come together to create something that begins to get depth, right? And some weight to it. How do you know? I think the only way to know is to do, which is almost sound like Yoda or something, right? which is a reference almost everyone who's listening to this will know. Right. So that's part of a narrative that we share.
Yep.
What we bring about. But I think that it comes back to the idea of do it and see what happens. Dig into the places that you're interested in. Are you really interested in a complex historical line? Then write it all out and then go back and rejigger it as you write. Are you interested in technology? Are you interested in the crafts? my sister, my eldest sister, was watching a TV show that she quite liked, but then she mentioned that she said, but I noticed that no one ever did any handwork. No one did any little artwork. There was that whole layer of society was just absent from the story of this not our modern Earth story. And so she noticed that. Now the writers, maybe it couldn't have been worked in, or maybe they just didn't think about working it in. But writers can bring, I mean, each writer brings something that really excites them about what they read, what they write, what they do in their own life. And I always feel like we can kind of draw on that to figure out what our base is, you know, what our foundation is.
I mean, I'm with you, Kate. I think you know, I mean, this is something that what you brought up is really important, which is this: we're never going to be perfect and be able to describe and evoke with vividness every aspect of the world that we're trying to build. And readers will have different interests, and they will notice, like your sister did, certain things that we neglect. I mean, you know, I know very little, practically none, about courtly intrigue. So there's no doubt that when I write novels like that, readers who really are into courtly intrigue and know the psychology of that sort of thing will just be like, well, you know, it's not there, it's absent from your story, and that's just something that I'm gonna have to live with. But if you do your job right, if you focus on the things that you care about and you're passionate about, and you do those things well, and make the reader really live in those aspects of your world that you're really passionate about, I think they'll generally forgive or even forget about the stuff that you don't pay attention to or just don't know enough about to evoke. I think it's more important to focus on the stuff you care about and really build those pieces with vividness, with empathy, with a kind of gesturing at the larger world that's out of your sight, you know, acknowledging the fact that you can't see everything and don't know everything.
You know, hold on. Oh my God, can you make, sorry, I'm going to interrupt you. When you said gesturing, take something specific and gesture at the larger world, but this is actually a little point of linkage. It's almost like hyperlinking, except for not, right? That's a way to suggest, rather than having everything narrowed down, like a horse with blinkers on it, right? All you need to do sometimes is just touch on, they walked past, you know, she walked past the knitting guild where her grandfather had been kicked out, you know, 50 years ago or whatever. And then there's a little window there. We may never see any more of that, but that creates those layers. I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, that's really my point. My point is that by focusing on the stuff that you're passionate about, you can make up for your lack of interest or just simple your blindness towards certain things. I mean, readers will notice that, but they may not necessarily punish you for it. The point is that if you do the parts that you do well enough, they won't care. If you do your job right and do the parts that you do well and care about, they won't care that you neglected other parts.
Well, because they come, I mean, any given writer is going to write the book that they can write. And that's what the readers come for what that writer is. So if they don't want what that writer writes, they're going to not read anymore by them. They're going to go to some other writer who is writing and has the things that they want to write in them. So in that sense, I think it's important for people to remember that this isn't about trying to copy other people.
No,
it's because you've got to, you kind of like go deeper into where you are, like the kernel of you and what you can bring to the story, which can
I always say that, you know, what fiction is not a communicative act in the traditional sense. It's not you giving the reader a set of directions about getting from point A to B, and if they don't get to point B, you've failed. That's not really what fiction is. Fiction is about you doing your best to convey your own unique perspective on the world. That's really it is. You are trying to evoke a world that is the world as you see it. And readers will relate to that in their own way. But what they care about is you being honest and doing the best job you can of conveying the world as you see it to them on the page, and then they figure it out on their own what their
If you have
relationship to that is.
questions, put them in the Q&A. One of the things when building a world, I think one thing that can be valuable for people who are trying to sort out how to do it, I do think like making lists of things to try to understand what aspects go into societies. Well, how does their economy work? And how does, is there trade? You may have those things or not, right? Can be useful to try to like sort things out. Another trick I think people can use, and one that I use all the time, is just simply to steal from history. To say, I'm going to think about 10th century Germany, and what are the things about 10th century Germany that interest me? And here's these events that happen. How can I filter them through this world? And how can I introduce magic? How can I look at the Han Dynasty? But because once you start, and the introduction of Buddhism, say during the Tang Dynasty, right? And how did that change things? Because once you start using history, if you're looking at history not just as a set of very shallow, discrete events, you begin to see how things influence each other. And I feel like that's how I have most learned how to world build in layers, is by reading history and saying, oh, this happened, and then that happened, and then this new influence happened, and then these people came, and then all of a sudden it doesn't look like this like single point story.
It's also particularly interesting to go and look at the primary sources as much as you can. Reading, for example, about the inscriptions and the writings of the first Buddhists in China as they were, donating to temples and so on. It's just fascinating to see what they wrote down and what they thought was important, how they saw the world. And just closer to home, it's been deeply fascinating to me to read over first hand primary sources written by Americans during the revolution and immediately afterwards, because you can sense that sense of optimism, and the way even the very idea of an American identity emerging, people who first wrote as, we're colonials, but we're British subjects. The king was just sort of not listening to us. But I'm sure if we work hard enough, he'll listen to us. To eventually, a couple of decades later, this great pride in being Americans, the sense that we are not other people, we are actually our own people. To see the emergence of that sense of national identity in people and in their own words, it's fascinating. And to think about, just sort of to observe everything they do, from following British fashion to shifting over to following French fashion, and then to sort of saying, we're going to evoke the styles of the Roman Republic because we are a republic, and we're going to be our own thing. There's actually a federal era in fashion. Just absolutely fascinating to see how people do this. But once you see that, you understand just how connected that we are to them. I mean, we're going through that right now. We are ourselves trying to figure out, what is our relationship to American power? What is our relationship to Silicon Valley? What is our relationship to the idea of AI? And we're now going through this process of coming up with narratives to narrate our own existence as intelligences whose worldview is shaped largely by AI. It's fascinating to see the degree to which, we sort of consciously and semi-consciously almost drifted to the state where every image we see and every image we take on our phones has been processed by machine learning. And we're just sort of we just sort of go with it. I mean, even in this moment as we go through Zoom, the very images we have of each other as being processed by machine learning.
That's
And
right.
we
That's
rarely
right.
even think about this. I look at all the thousands of photos on my phone and I'm sort of like, wow, not a single one of these is the way my eyes saw things. Every single one of these is an image processed by machines thinking, learning from other images that have been tagged as good. It's wild to think about this. But anyway, but the thing is, that's not unique to us. History is always like this, where people are living through these momentous changes that we later on give a name to and think that they lived in this moment that's somehow static, but it's not. Every single person goes through this huge process of historical change as they embody it and live through it. And knowing that helps me in writing my characters, in realizing that, you know, some people are completely unaware of their own role in the history flowing through them, and other people are incredibly self-conscious about it, and they want to write about it. I mean, I have this memory very vividly of I was in law school at the moment when 9/11 happened. And I remember that morning we were all in shock. And I remember one person, one of my classmates, took out his laptop and started writing, as I sit here on this day that will no doubt change history. Like he knew, he was very
Yeah.
self-aware that he
Yeah.
was living through this moment of change and he wanted to record it. And that was a level of self-awareness that I don't think I had at the time. I was just sort of trying to be in the moment and process it. I was not trying to think through my own role in that. But it taught me, some people are really aware of that. They're keenly aware of the sense of history changing and then them living through that moment. So it just makes writing about change in your fantasy world so much more nuanced and complicated and interesting to me to know that people have these different reactions to going through change.
It makes me also think about how if straight up world building, like this idea that I'm going to create this massive world with these layers of technology and language and cultural change, the way Ken Liu did it in the Dandelion Dynasty. So someone sitting at their desk with not a lot of experience may find that daunting, because it's a daunting process to have done all that. But maybe one window to it is to say, forget all, just don't think about that. Think about the character. Who is this character? Why are they thinking the way they are in the book right now, right here, where I'm starting? Or what is their view of the past? What are their hopes for the future? What are their view of other people and why? And then that's one character. So what about this next character? You said yourself at the beginning of Grace of Kings that you have people coming at from two different angles, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that immediately creates deeper world building than if everybody has the same agreed upon worldview.
Mm-hmm. See, that's the thing, right? I think a lot of times when we're learning history, we really learn history in this very flawed manner. We learn about
Definitely
history.
in the US we do, yeah.
Yeah, we're taught, at least, in the younger grades, the idea that this is the idea to take away about this period of time. This is the essential idea that you have to have. So you end up with this impression somehow that everybody agreed on the narrative at the time, or everybody had this one thing that they knew they had to know. But that's just not true. It's just not true. We don't agree on anything, and people living through it, it was incredibly, contentious. Uh, the even the political parties didn't emerge with their ideas fully intact. These things end up evolving over time. Everything is change, everything's flux. So, and knowing that there is no fixed thing that you can tease out of a moment of history, that it's always confusing, chaotic, changing, and people trying to impose their narrative on the moment. I think that helps a lot to know that that's reality. This sort of confusion, this sort of competing narratives is reality for throughout human history. We don't have a fixed thing. Even in the most repressive regimes, they They can't impose a uniform narrative on everybody. It's just not, that's just not how humans work.
Yes, and we see that all the time as well, and we see that we're watching that go on right now.
Exactly.
In our own world, this
Mhm.
battle or this existential, struggle between the the restrictive, repressive people who want to say this view of the past is the only one that counts, or it's the way I want to say it, and the people for whom life is far more complicated. And again, if world building can be done simply and it can be satisfying, if that's the vibe, right, or the aesthetic or the story that you want to tell. And then if you want to build something, I really think that way of looking at how change and layers filter through characters and figuring out where you're starting from, maybe where you hope to go, even if you don't fully know where that is.
Yeah, I never know exactly how I'm supposed to get there. I just have a vague idea of where I want to go. And, but that's kind of true of all characters, all of us, really. We have a yearning, we have a thing we really want, but we don't necessarily know how we're going to get there. And we sort of, we have to try it out.
Well, that's why I like, what is it they say? The only way out is through. That's the other thing about world building. I can look at my work over the last 30 years, and I can see changes in how I did things. And the only way I could have done it was to do it. And each time you either create a new world or expand on a world or add a volume to your story, you're building on it. You're building on the knowledge base you have and the skill you have for creating these layered, nuanced, complicated worlds. I just want to quickly say that if anybody has a question, now is the time to ask.
Oh, yeah, already.
Yeah,
oh my
gosh. I know, right? I knew this would happen. Sometimes I prepare with a whole bunch of questions, and sometimes I'm just like, we'll talk. Let me see. Is there anything that you can think of offhand that's like a practical statement or option for writers?
Well, probably just a formalization of some of the things we talked about here, which is recognizing that in any human society, contra the way history was taught to you in elementary school, people were not told explicitly, we live in this era and this is what we believe in. That's not how that works. It has never worked that way. That your character's beliefs are complicated, that every culture is complicated and internally contradictory. You can very well have a culture that believes deeply in the sanctity of human life while still allowing weapons to proliferate, to kill people. We live in one right now. So there's no reason to think that somehow this is what gets me, right? I sometimes see people criticizing fantasy books or works by saying something like, well, this is just inconsistent, X culture is like this is just inconsistent. It's inconsistency is the very way.
Like, because our world isn't inconsistent at all. And sometimes it's just not even accepting that, being able to see it. And some people, some readers and some human beings don't like that. They want the simple, very simple way of looking, black and white, binary, good, bad, one road. They don't like the complications, but that's not our responsibility.
No,
as artists.
It's not. Yeah. You just have to, you can only portray the world as you understand it. That's what I say. You have to be true to your own understanding of the world. you're not responsible for the fact that some readers will just fundamentally disagree with your understanding of the world, and they're not going to be able to resonate with the thing you've done, and that's okay. That's just inevitable.
I think that's actually a great place to close, with saying you're only responsible for you've got to go from where you are and what
Yep.
you want to accomplish, and what you want the story to accomplish, and to think in a way more as closely as anyone can, right? Because we bring our own blind spots and prejudices in, and our own props and expectations into these things too, and that's part of the process. And that's what makes every story unique in my mind. Well, Ken, thank you. This was just as fun as I knew it would be.
And also, we didn't go over time, which is also
being
rare.
Very careful. Well, they have so the next event for those of you who are here with us is the writing, the 2-hour writing thing. I can't remember what the actual name of it is. I'm so embarrassed. But with the flight crew is hosting it today. And for those of you who are tuning in on YouTube, thank you for listening to us go on. Next month, I'm back with Susan Dennard, and oh my gosh, Nathan, can you remember what we're actually going to talk about? Failure.
Oh gosh.
Yeah.
Fun topic.
Susan and I are going to talk about what does failure mean. So it won't specifically be about writing craft, but about.
Well, I am an expert on failure. I have failed so many times in so many ways. It's.
Thank you, Nathan. You are not a failure. Dealing with writerly fear, doubt, frustration, and despair. And Deppy says, yeah. So I hope
is a good one.
Yeah. We know that space well. Okay. Thank you, Ken. I'll see many of you back again. And I want to thank you all for being here. And thank you to Nathan, as always, and the Nebula platform. Nathan Lucas for being the tech guy, and the Nebula platform, and SFWA for hosting this video cast, webinar, or whatever it's called. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Kate, for having me, and thank you, everyone.